build trust. So to build trust online, whenever a party A and party B transacts online, they do not know each other by face. They cannot look at each other. So the surefire way to build trust to enable online transactions is to have a verifiable identity for digital services, for digital spaces. And that's basically our objective. It's to give all individuals and all residents of Ethiopia this ability to identify themselves. And I'll briefly go through the history of the program for the past couple of years, our objectives, principles, ecosystem, process flow, and basically where we are. National ID, or as we are now calling it, digital ID, has existed in one form or another in Ethiopia for almost more than a decade now. But the latest iteration, the latest evolution of this idea started in 2018. It was initiated by the Prime Minister's Office, then Ministry of Peace, Ministry of Innovation, and other entities were involved to carry this assignment. In 2021, as of the end of last year, October, November, this program was housed under the PM office. So this is the history. The vision is to build sustainable digital identification, supporting all use cases for all citizens and residents. So by use cases, we mean service providers. For instance, if you are a healthcare provider, you are one use case. If you are a bank, you are another use case. If you are a microfinance institute, you're another use case. So the idea is not just to issue digital identification to residents, but to enable the use cases to authenticate. That makes the life cycle complete. The first life cycle is the issuance of the digital identification, and the second is the service provision. And that part is ongoing, it's operational. Once I get my digital ID as Mr. Yodahe, I'll get a 12-digit ID number. So I go to the bank, I go to the health center, I go to the school and present myself, present my digital ID, this 12-digit number, and that particular use case or service provider, whether it's an online service or physical in-person service, should be able to authenticate who I am. So our vision and our mission basically is to build that trust between individuals, between entities, between service providers and service seekers. And our motto, we still haven't found the English version for it, but the Amharic version, it says, and so and no. It basically means whatever sector I'm in, wherever I am, my identity remains the same, whether I'm a student or a patient at a hospital or a businessman who wants to take out a loan. The individual remains the same. So every sector should identify the individual as such. So the 12-digit ID number is basically the digital ID. It's not a card, but it's a number. So we're not issuing physical cards, but we're issuing numbers. That's one of the reasons why we're calling it digital ID as opposed to national ID, because national identification has become a thing of the past now. Countries are moving to digital identification. And as a latecomer, Ethiopia should fully take advantage of this latecomer advantage. We should not go through the iterations that other countries have gone through. India is a very good example for this. They have directly gone to a digital ID and skipped the national ID card-based identification system. And Ethiopia is, we feel, fully ready to adopt digital ID. Nonetheless, I will get into the detail later on, but physical credentials, the cards we carry in our pocket are important. And we have a strategy to address the physical card issuance. So this 12-digit ID number and then the IT infrastructure, building it is also another objective. The legal framework, the laws, the proclamations, the regulations have to be in place. We're working on that. We have to integrate with existing service provider and more particularly with civil registration offices in Kabbalis, and we're also working on that as well. The principles we have adopted the 10 principles, the 10 international principles of sustainable identification. Sustainable identification for development. There is an international principle developed by a World Bank working group in identity. So the top 3 are here. One of them is leave no one behind. It has to be inclusive. Kabali ID, for instance, is not inclusive. It requires that you have a house, requires that your landlord testifies on your behalf. There are many requirements, so it's not inclusive. If you talk about a driver's license, or if you talk about other types of identifications, they are not as inclusive, but digital ID should be inclusive. If I am, for instance, a shoe shiner who has come from some part of the country to Addis without any documentation, that means I will not be able to identify myself. I will not be able to get any service. So there is a good percentage of the population that are excluded from different services due to lack of proper identification. So identification is not important for the government. It's not important for the banks as much as it's important for the individual. So this principle is everyone has a right to identify themselves, so it has to be inclusive. The second is the design has to be dependable. If a bank or if a finance institute or if, any service providers that you can think of depends on our service, on digital ID service to authenticate their customers, it has to be dependable. Otherwise, it's as good as all types of IDs like the Kabali ID or national ID. Digital ID has to have a dependable service, dependable digital service. And the third one is governance. Information that we collect is very sensitive. You cannot change your face, you cannot change your fingerprint, you cannot change your iris. So it has to have proper oversight. There has to be check and balance. There has to be accountability, as well as system security. The data we collect, we've also made sure we comply with international best practices. One of them is called data minimization principle. That means you don't collect data that you don't need. For instance, in the old ID systems, we have a type of data field called Liu Milikit, or like a special identifying feature on your face, for example. If I have some kind of scar, maybe they write that down as a field. Fields that are that we consider conventional but are not necessary for digital identification, we have excluded. For instance, occupation is a common field that's collected in the past. Whenever you want to get a Kabali ID, they ask you, what's your job? Are you jobless? Do you work for government? Do you work for a bank, etc.? So we don't collect that. Why? Because data minimization states you only collect data that you need. And the data we need is our business is identifying people. So we only collect data that's the minimum to identify. So we do not collect mother's name. We do not collect religion or other sensitive fields that everyone always talks about, especially in Ethiopia. So the demographics, it's the 4 mandatory fields are these: the name, the date of birth, the gender, and the residential current address. We also require documentation for people who come to be registered. We categorize them into proof of consent, proof of identity, proof of address, proof of citizenship. Either of these 4 we accept, but in the case that someone does not have anything, no birth certificate, no driver's license, no passport, no Kabali ID, then we obviously we have to be inclusive. So we will take a testimony. If I bring another person that will testify on my behalf saying, my name is Yodahe, then without any documentation, we still register people. This proof of consent, proof of identity, we don't go through a background check. We don't do any kind of due diligence, because we also follow another interesting principle. It's called, you can only lie once. If I say my name is Ababa and I'm 19 years old, that's going to be a fact forever because of number 3. We collect biometrics, and that biometrics, the facial, the fingerprint, the iris, it's permanently connected to the identification, to the demographic data that I supply at the time of registration. So this year, if I say my name is Ababa and I come back 5 years later with another name, obviously the platform we have does its own deduplication, it does its own due diligence. So unless someone comes with the proper channel of changing their name or changing their address, it's not going to be possible to change. So that we follow this principle of you can only lie once. We have 4 important ecosystems, but due to time, I will not go into the details of each. The residents, they are the primary stakeholders. They are the ones that will be issued the digital identification. The relying parties are the banks, the microfinance, the health center, the school, the safety net program, you name it, any service provider. Then the third part of the ecosystem is the identity provider. Here it says authentication, but it's the identity provider. So the IDP is the one that gives service to the relying party. It's different from the national ID program. National ID program manages the ecosystem. It does not mean it's the one that's offering the authentication service. Authentication service, we plan to outsource. Banks, institutions, authorized bodies can authenticate relying parties. And finally, it's the technology vendors, the ones that provide the hardware, the license, the integration, etc. The platform we use, we call it FIDA ID Management System, FIDA IDMS. It's based off of an open source platform called MOSIP. MOSIP has set the gold standard for identification for developing countries. A lot of countries are adopting it, including the Philippines, Morocco, Togo, Benin. Countries that have recently deployed their ID system are building their core platform, their IDMS, on top of MOSIP. And we've been working on MOSIP, customizing it for almost 2 years now. And it avoids vendor locking, which is a very important concept here. Many identification programs internationally, as well as in Ethiopia locally, such as revenue system for TIN number, the immigration system for passport, etc., are suffering because of vendor locking. What vendor locking means is a vendor comes, they deliver everything end to end. Every technology from A to Z belongs to them. That effectively locks in the owner. For instance, if we do an agreement with vendor A this year, and 10 years later something is not working out, we cannot get our data back. We're locked in with that vendor forever. Without their goodwill, we cannot migrate our data. Without their goodwill, we are not the owners of data. So that's the most important thing we are avoiding by choosing MOSIP. Also, data is very private. It's multiple layers of security, hardware level security, software level security. Data is secure in flight, in storage, etc. If you have any of these, anyone in this audience, if you have the time, you're very much welcome to do a little research on MOSIP, and many of your questions may be answered there. The process flow, it looks like this one. There is registration, validation, ID number generation, and issuance of the credentials through SMS, email, post office. And then finally, and most importantly, is the authentication, or what we call the EKYC, the electronic know your customer service that we provide, or other IDPs provide. Just skip this part. So just to show you where we are now, laboratory-based pilot was launched almost 2 years now, in 2020. The laboratory-based pilot ended last year, May, almost 1 year ago. Then the field-based pilot started and ended very shortly in June. Now we're currently in the in the use case pilot phase, and the next, the coming November, apologies, the coming this July, we will the current end of the Ethiopian 2014 fiscal year, we will launch the pre-launch pilot phase. In the use case pilot, our target is 100,000 people. In the pre-launch pilot, our target is 500,000 people. And eventually, the big target, it's not here, but the big target is end of 2025, or in the Ethiopian calendar, it's mid-2018. We plan to reach 70 million people, to issue 70 million digital IDs to Ethiopian residents. So here is a little explanation of each phase. We can share this slide with anyone interested. So let me just run through this. So this is the number I mentioned. The 4-year target is 70 million. We have many strategies that we've laid out. I have explained in one form or another some of our strategies. But with regards to enrollment, we have 3 channels. The first one is direct enrollment. That means National ID program will have its own registration officers. What we call the kits are the biometric devices. So we'll have our own biometric device and our own facilities in select location, in select areas, and we will register. The second one is use case based enrollment or onboarding. Whenever I go to open a bank account at Commercial Bank of Ethiopia or at Dashan Bank or Burhan or whatever service provider we are in agreement with. For instance, just this week we signed an agreement with Ethiopost. They have around 715 post offices around the country. So we plan to use the post office, the telecom office, the banks, etc., any service provider that agrees to onboard people. So the post office worker will be the one taking your fingerprint, taking your data, and registering you in this case, or the telecom marketing personnel, or the bank teller. So that's the second channel. The third channel is a commercial arrangement where a lease company or a finance company, a microfinance company, loans the registration kit. These registration kits are not cheap, they are costly. So, you know, young ladies are just graduated looking for a job, may not necessarily afford it. It's between 100,000 and 200,000 birr. So this lease company buys the kit, stocks it, and then whenever an applicant comes, they lease it, or they basically sell it, but on rent, on a loan. So this job seeker will take that device, open up a kiosk somewhere, start up a small shop somewhere, or take a window in some mall, in some building, in some facility, then registers people. Whenever she registers people, and whenever that registration is adjudicated on our side to be good quality, we set aside a certain amount to pay to that individual, to that business owner, or to that shop. We're thinking somewhere between 20 and 40 birr, you know, depending on the on how the, you know, in the next 3-4 years, on how the price and the cost of living goes. But the idea is these people, so that these people, these business owners, these job seekers, can have a decent living wage, can generate a decent revenue from registering people. They can pay back the rent while registering people and helping us meet our target. So we have 3 channels. And obviously, the outcomes of digital ID, you know it better than myself. So many benefits. To minimize, someone is unmute, so maybe you can mute him. So to minimize fraud, to minimize security, to increase security, for better social welfare, for better health services, for better insurance, for better finance, basically for better trust as a nation. So, there is a lot that can be said about the benefits of digital ID. His Excellency, the PM, said a successfully implemented digital ID will generate better income for the nation, better savings, a lot more than many of our mega projects, including the JERT. This digital ID, if properly implemented, can have a big impact on our GDP, on savings, on the private sector. The impact on the economy is tremendous. So we have already launched some registration. Right now we have somewhere about 40 registration stations for the current pilot we're working on. As I said, we collect 3 types of biometric, 442 fingerprint, dual iris, and then the facial photo for deduplication. This can be collected offline. Connectivity is not required. For instance, it's a very common case where our enrollment officers do not push their data for 2 weeks, for 3 weeks. They can work offline, but whenever they find a connection or they find the time, they can push it after a supervisor approves it, of course. So it works completely offline, and that's one of the advantages of this FIDA platform. And then we issue the registration confirmation. This is a paper we issue on site at the time of registration. This does not include the 12-digit ID number. This is only the temporary registration number here. 12-digit ID number comes depending on the availability of our infrastructure, from a few minutes to a few hours. An SMS is automatically sent by the system with the 12-digit ID number. Now we're getting into an agreement with the post office so that they can also help us distribute the final 12-digit ID number, the digital ID, what we call the FIDA identification number, FIN, as well as the alias number, FIDA alias number. I'm sure as part of your curriculum as DFI alumni, you would know about virtual IDs. So the alias number is the virtual ID. We can generate virtual ID for sectors, depending, for instance, for the finance sector alone, we can generate 1 virtual ID, or based on the user's demand. If I want to authenticate myself online, for instance, and I don't know the website, I don't trust the website, I do not want to give my unique ID number, which does not change throughout my life. So I can generate an alias number from the residence portal and then give it to the service provider. So I can securely identify myself, and from the user provider's perspective, does not matter if it's an alias number, it does not matter if it's a unique digital ID number. Both of them are equally trustworthy and can equally be used to verify a person. And we have also prepared a template for our ID card. This template, as I said, our strategy does not include printing a card, but if a bank or a certain region, regional government or city government decides, let me take your template and adopt it to my own, we prepared a template. And this big QR code you see here is specially generated. It's digitally signed. It's not a normal simple QR code that directs you to a URL, but this is a digitally signed and encrypted QR code that can be used for offline authentication. So if there is no connectivity, I can just scan with my smartphone without the need for a network. And if I have the authorized app on my phone, I can verify whether this ID is authentic, this ID card is authentic or not. We have our international partners that we have so far worked with. That includes the World Bank, amongst others. And if anyone is interested, you can take a screenshot of this slide. It has some of our links and some of our documentation. including if you take a look at the last URL, id.jovi.t/nid specifications. We have published both our hardware specification and our software API specification as well. So thank you, Mabet, back to you.
Thank you, Yodahe, for that very comprehensive presentation. So now we can go to the Q&A session. What we'll do is I have a few questions for you. So I'll start, maybe I'll ask 1 or 2 questions, and then we will take maybe 1 question from participants and then back to me, and we will continue like that. So for my first question, you mentioned that we should take advantage of the latecomer advantage, and that for instance, like countries like India, and learned from what countries like India have done, and some other countries that have used also the MOSFET platform include Morocco and the Philippines. So I wanted to understand which country models were benchmarked when developing the ID program, and how does it compare to these country models? How does our country program compare to these other ones?
Should I address this one, or you have more questions?
Yeah, you'll address it, and then I'll continue with the next question.
We have benchmarked countries. Mostly our focus was on countries that are of similar demographic, similar economic level, similar level of literacy as Ethiopia. That includes countries like Nigeria, countries like India, Kenya, the Philippines, Morocco. So those are the primary countries that we've looked at. But we have also looked at very advanced countries, wealthier countries, both in terms of digital literacy, as well as connectivity and all other human development indexes, such as Estonia, United Arab Emirates. So we have, with a few of these, we've had experience sharing sessions to learn from their ID programs and their journey. With the others, we've looked at documentation that's available publicly, and also we've looked at there is a World Bank ID4D report, annual report that basically benchmarks each country's digital identification program. So we've looked at that document as well.
Thank you. So now let's come to enrollment. And you mentioned that upon enrollment, you're provided with a confirmation of the registration, and eventually you get the unique ID number. But I wanted to understand a bit more about instances where you're not printing an ID card or a credential. How does it work? Do users just provide, or like individuals who've received a number, just provide that when they need a service? How does it work if they don't have a credential to show for it?
You may have a credential, but you may also lose it, right? When you go to the bank, you have the card in your pocket. So there is obviously multiple ways of authentication with multiple levels of trust. For instance, if you want to transfer 1 million birr versus if you want to transfer 2,000 birr, there is different levels of trust required by the bank. So just like that, we also have different levels of trust we provide. So during authentication, for instance, if I remember my 12-digit ID number by heart, then that gives a certain level of trust. We call it level 1. So I say, my name is Yodahe, here is my 12-digit number, give me service. That's one level. Next to that one, if the service provider wants to give a higher level of trust, such as a single fingerprint reader, where the bank or the service provider asks for my most of our authentication levels of trust that we provide do not require a physical credential. Physical credential may give this added level of trust, but as far as we're concerned, the only value it has is a reminder of what your 12 ID digits is. You can write it on a piece of paper, you can save it on your phone. In fact, there is, on our resident service, there is a component of identification, a type of identification called mobile ID. So if you have, whether you have a smartphone or a feature phone, you can have some kind of either feature phone based or smartphone based application that you can install on your phone. So as long as your battery is not dead, that means you have an ID.
That definitely makes life easier, which is good. We could take one question from participants. If anyone has a question, please raise your hand, or you can write it in the chat. Okay, we have a question here from Nabiyu Mangustu. Let's see. So it's very clear and nice presentation. Would you mind informing us your plan regarding the authentication, KYC verification for different use case provision? Are you planning to avail your API for each and every organization in need, or are you planning to avail the same to the national switch, which has a viable integration or available integration to the financial sector? And the next question is either no or any risk in using MOSIP. Yodahe, you're on mute if you're responding.
Hello, may I add? Hello?
Henok?
Yes, please.
Okay.
May I raise some questions if possible?
Okay, you can go ahead, and then we'll give Yodahe an opportunity to respond. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So should I start?
Yes, please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. 3 questions. One, we have heard this program to be launched before years. Because of various reasons, it delayed, and still it is not publicized or not started the service. So what were those challenges or impediments? If possible, Mr. Yodahe will raise it. Number 2, we have experienced so many types of system malfunctions while we are approaching banks just to withdraw cash or to transact electronically. I think this national digital ID may face such kind of problems. So how are your readiness to, curb some problems like in relation to connectivity or in relation to infrastructures, maybe? So how are you, withstand those challenges that are easily dictated by the bankers and those customers are experiencing in the banking service? Number 3, do you have a model country that are using national ID from the benefit, for example, from the economic development perspective, job creation, fair income distribution, gender participation, price regulation? So maybe this kind of factors or positive impacts will be considered in this service one way or the other. These are 3 questions that I have. I thank you very much.
Thank you, Henok. Yodahe, over to you.
Yes, I'm back. I was trying to charge my laptop. Apologies.
Oh, no problem.
So
did you get the questions?
Yeah, I heard everything, and
okay, perfect. Okay, please go ahead.
The first one from Nabiyu, it's a very good question. So in the last slide that I shared, let me share it again. Can you see my screen now?
Yeah, we can still see your screen.
Great. In ID specifications, there you'll find the API documentation. So it's not something we limit to public service providers. If you have a website and you're selling pizza, you can just connect with this API. It's not 100% public now. We have only shared the sandbox version. So the base URL and others you have to discuss with our engineering team. But eventually any authorized service provider will be able to access this API for a small amount of charge, few cents every time you request an authentication. Small amount of charge would be necessary, but other than that, it's public and the sandbox is already published. So if you want to integrate, if you want to test the API, it's open and it's out there. The documentation is here. The next question was from the other colleague. His first question is what delayed the program. It's a long story. It's in Ethiopian calendar, it started in 2004, and I'm not going to bore you through 12 years of history of what happened, blah blah. So we're just looking forward, and the target right now is 2025. We will have the majority, a good majority of adults issued with digital ID. The second question was, how do you deal with this issue of lack of network element? How do you deal with it? We have two major operations. The first one is onboarding. The second one is authentication. So when we onboard people, as I mentioned earlier, we don't need network. So no one can say network element for onboarding. For authentication, offline and online authentication is possible. So for online authentication, we do not want the banks whose core business relies on KYC to be dependent on a single source of truth. That's why we have federated the identification provision. So anyone authorized can become an ID service provider if they have the capacity. For instance, if commercial bank decides I'm going to host the ID, I'm going to become an IDP, then we go into a special agreement which has financial connotations, and they can provide service to their own customers within their own data center, within their own environment, so that they will not depend on whether the NID data center is up or not. So we have many ways of addressing this. We also, our architecture, this MOSI platform is microservice based. So we will distribute our services across different data centers. We're not going to build our own entirely. Wherever there is resource, if another government ministry has some resource, another agency, a commercial cloud service provider, as long as they're based in Ethiopia, we can place it anywhere. So that's our mechanism. That's our strategy of addressing the issue of network element. Do you have a model country? That we have, I mentioned India. India is a very good model, and they have reaped the benefits of properly implementing digital ID. Their direct benefits transfer program has saved a lot of money within 1 year, that they already had return on investment within a few years of launching their program from the savings within one specific program called, their direct benefits transfer, which is equivalent to the Ethiopian productive safety net program. So there's obviously many benefits, and India is a good example. I think
thanks, Yodahe. There was one more question before I move on. This is around, is there any risk in using MOSIP?
We have, whenever the issue of risk comes up, the biggest risk we always mention is security and data privacy and protection. So this issue is not limited to MOSIP. Whether we buy an application, an ID management system from vendors, whether we work with MOSIP, it remains the same. Whenever you digitize data and whenever you put it in a centralized way, the biggest risk is either being hacked or destruction of your data, loss of your data. Those two are big risks. And obviously, we have identified them as risks and we're working towards addressing them.
Thank you. So I'll come back to my questions and then back to participants. So we talked about the National ID program being guided by the principles on identification for sustainable development that focus on inclusion, robust design, and governance. So from the perspective of inclusion, multiple languages are spoken and used in Ethiopia. Can individuals access the registration services in different languages? Will ID credentials be issued in different languages? And how will this work during authentication?
So let me just guide that user to this link, the second one from the bottom, id.gov.it/documents. It talks about all these issues, how we plan to manage language, local language versus federal language versus English. So you're welcome to go through that document.
So, but at a high level, we can say that those differences in languages will be accommodated?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay.
As a digital platform, we do not want to limit the user to a language that they are not comfortable with. But at the same time, we have to comply with local laws and regulations. So we added multiple languages for a single registrant. For instance, they can, the mandatory would be English and the regional language, but then again, federal or any other language of choice can be added as a third option.
Okay, that's fantastic. My next question is, how is the registration process and the facility accommodating for differently abled individuals? For example, what happens if fingerprints are, for instance, faded from old age or hard labor, or if individuals are lost their hands or they're visually impaired? Is it still possible to do an iris scan, or in what way can the data requirements be fulfilled? And are the registration facilities, for instance, wheelchair friendly, or are the consent forms, for instance, available in Braille?
So as far as onboarding is concerned, obviously inclusive has to include people that are differently, I forgot the term for it, differently
abled, yes.
So differently able people, for instance, if a person is blind and we collect dual iris, obviously that will be an exception for that particular individual. We will not collect the iris, and we will say it's an exception case, and there is a way of managing exceptions. If a person is missing hand or a finger, or if their fingerprint is unreadable, the same case, there is always an exception to that rule. Also for minors, for newborns or minors that are below a certain age, biometrics will not be mandatory. Digital ID can be issued without biometrics. That being said, the last bit you said about Braille-friendly identification credentials, we have not worked on that yet. However, the mobile ID is as a digital platform. There is applications, text-to-speech applications, etc., that translate everything on that speak out loud. But the physical credential, we've not worked on that one yet, but it's something we can consider.
Thank you. One more question before we go back to the participant. What considerations were taken around cultural religious norms in the registration or authentication process? For example, if you have a female agent conducting registration or authentication and the fingerprint of a male user is faded, usually the agent would need to assist by pressing down the person's finger on the reader. However, this can go against users' religious norms, for instance. And similarly, if the agent were a male and the user a female, similar issues can arise. From a cultural perspective and the physical interaction, that would not be acceptable. How do you navigate this dynamic and ensure this doesn't present as a barrier for registration or usage?
So in our pilot program, whenever for religious or cultural reason, an individual, for instance, a female registrant does not want to be or wants to be registered by a male officer, that's what we do. By a female officer, we make sure female officer is available. So that's how we handle it. Other than that, face is mandatory if an individual wants to wear their niqab or does not want to take off their niqab during in an open office setting, then we will advise them to go to a special registration office where they can take off their niqab and register in private, in their own privacy. So that's what we're doing so far. But we'll have, once we go into the country rollout phase, we'll have operational procedures on how to handle these cases.
Okay, thank you. So now I'll go to questions from the audience. If some questions were addressed in the presentation, I might skip them just for the sake of time and avoiding repetition. So we have Jean-Luc, who's an alumni from Madagascar. And the question is on, he says the national ID program is quite innovative, but what was the main difficulty and issue that NID and the program had faced that make the program as inclusive as possible? I think we may have touched on that just now. Do you want to add anything to that Yodahe, or I can move to the next question?
I mean, this issue of being inclusive.
Yeah. We've covered it, yeah.
That's well to see our principle of inclusion.
Okay, so the next question we have is from Mohammed, and it's around, will it be compulsory to integrate the 12-digit ID number when issuing Qabale ID or other types of IDs?
So the question is, will it be compulsory to have a Qabale ID to get a digital ID?
To integrate the 12-digit ID number, which is, I'm guessing, the FIDA, the new one, the new unique ID, when issuing Qabale ID or other types of IDs?
So the Qabale ID, what we normally call the Qabale ID, is a city resident identification card. So city residency has a different, very different procedure from ours. We only prove, are you Mr. Mohammed or not? But they have to prove whether you live in Addis for 2 years, whether it's basically a proof of address, that one. And ours is a proof of identity. So we consider the city government, city resident ID as one use case. It's just like a bank book or a driver's license. It's just one use case. So if that use case is willing to rely on the digital ID, it's up to them. But from the government side, the direction is these city resident cards, as well as civil registration cards, should be based on digital ID. So when you want to renew your Qabale ID after a few 1 or 2 years, then getting your digital ID first will be mandatory. But the plan is, it's going to be seamless. You're not going to go to another window to get a digital ID and another window to get your Qabale ID. Same place, except the data that's collected, some of it goes to our database, some of it goes to the city government database.
Okay. So in moving on to design, you mentioned that FIDA has been customized based on the MOSIP platform to fit the Ethiopian context and meet the national priorities. Can you tell us more about the customization that was done for the context of Ethiopia?
Obviously, the number one thing that comes to mind is the language. There is obviously the language customization. We have allowed, for instance, if your name is Mabet, you write Mabet in a certain way in Amharic, you write it in a certain way in English. And depending on which region you're registering from, you may choose, you may have another format of writing your name on a regional language. So that's the first thing we've modified. But everything we've modified, we've not made public due to, of course, privacy and security issues. We've worked on it for almost 2 years now, and we've done many modifications and adoptions. For instance, from the registration side, the fields that are applicable in Ethiopia may not be applicable in India or Philippines. So every country adopts or changes the fields as per their own requirements. We have also made a lot of work on integration of FIDA IDMS with other services such as AVIS, what we call the automatic biometric identification system. We've made integration with AVISs. We've made integration with these peripheries, fingerprint devices, iris devices, etc. So we've done a lot of work.
Okay. So I have one question here from Ababao. It says, what happens when an ID card is stolen? What proof is used to decide who gets a card? So maybe if you can talk to us a little bit about that process that one would take to replace their ID.
So as I mentioned earlier, what we call digital ID is not a card. So digital ID is never lost. You may forget it, but it doesn't mean you've lost it. So if you do not remember your 12-digit ID number and you don't have a physical credential with you, you can go to any branch, do certain procedures such as giving your fingerprint, then you can get your number back. Whether what you want to do with that particular number, whether you want to print it, laminate it, print it on a plastic card is up to the user. We don't issue a standard card for everyone. As I mentioned earlier, the digital ID philosophy is one step evolved from that one. That one is the national ID.
Okay, thank you. So I'll now move on to questions around governance in terms of the principles of identification. So there's a growing recognition of the power of ID systems and the potential for misuse, and thus the need for an independent authority to provide oversight, accountability, and recourse over such systems. Currently, NIDP sits as a program under the PMO's office, but we also know that digital ID proclamation has been drafted and you already started public consultation. What are the key concerns that were raised by stakeholders during these consultations, and when should we expect the law to be passed and an independent ID authority to be established?
So that's a good question. It's also our question, Mabet. So there is variables such as that are out of our control. It's not the government that establishes this entity, it's the parliament. And the House of People's Representatives have their own timeline. But as far as we're concerned, our plan is to have the law passed in the current Ethiopian fiscal year before end of June.
Okay, that's good to know. Moving on, there's an interesting study that was done by Caribou Digital on identities, new practices in a connected age. This is from 2017. And it says for many, the cost of time spent registering for or replacing or amending identity credentials is too high. And so people, often those that need it the most, are excluded from the benefits and services to which they are entitled. And we've kind of touched on the issue of replacement, or getting a credential again, or retrieving your ID number if you lose it or if you forget it. But these things can really shape how users perceive the value of their credentials. So user data ownership and control is one of the key principles of identity. And I understand that our national ID program has also adopted this, but how can users manage their digital identity? What is the level of user consent and control? And do users have a say in terms of what information on their digital identity can be accessed and by whom? And can they easily and efficiently correct errors in their data? For instance, if there was a spelling mistake. Sorry, if you're not speaking, can you please mute your mic? Thank you. Yeah, so can they, as I was saying, can they easily and efficiently correct errors in their data? Let's say changing their address, date of birth, spelling errors. And would you be able to share an example of what process one could follow in order to do this?
Yeah, it's a good question, that one. So there is, as part of this platform IDMS we're using, there is a component called resident portal. So it's both a web-based portal as well as a super app, a big app that has small applications in it that you can install on your Android phone, iPhone, or any other mobile phone. So both this web-based portal and your mobile app, your mobile ID application, they serve more or less similar purposes. What they do is what you mentioned earlier. For instance, you can see who has had access to your data, like an audit. Has Dashen Bank used my credentials for authentication? Has Mr. X used my credential? Has website Y used my credentials? So you can see an audit of who has used your credentials for authentication. You also have full control in terms of consent during authentication without the user's consent. Any third party, whether it's a public entity, a private entity, a website, a digital service provider, cannot take an individual's credential without the individual's consent. So there they have control. But in this residence portal, there is many services that are available. But some services, such as changing your name, obviously are not allowed to do online because that has obvious implications for fraud. So that will have to go through the legal procedures, and an officer and the supervisor have to approve. And some of these changes, such as your name, may require you to come in person. But other than that, small changes such as your email address or your other fields that are non-sensitive fields, you can change online.
Okay, that's fantastic. I will move on to the next question from the participant. It's Nabi, you again. He has a question around, during the offline registration process, how do you make sure the uniqueness of the generated ID number and alias number, since different operators might use the system at the same time in offline mode simultaneously?
Sorry, Mawait, if you can repeat the question.
Sure. Okay. The question is on, during the offline registration process, how do you make sure the uniqueness of the generated ID number and alias numbers if multiple or different operators are using it at the same time or are registering users at the same time?
On the file identification number, not on the FIN, nor on the FAN, not on the alias number. The duplication is done after those two numbers are translated, and it's done at the back end. So whether someone uses your FIN or your FAN, eventually it leads to the same profile. So there is no risk of whether you use your virtual ID or your unique ID. Authentication is the same.
Okay, thank you. Going to the rollout process, according to the website, I saw that over 9,000 pilot registrations have been completed to date. And can you tell us about the lessons, the key lessons that you've learned so far from the pilot? And have you discovered anything surprising or unexpected in the process?
Like a good government website, we have not updated the latest figures on our website. It's definitely, we're closing now 20,000, and before end of June, our target is 100,000. But there is one of the reasons we're calling this a pilot. It's because we're learning and adjusting. We're changing a lot of things based on the field trial we're doing.
Anything surprising, something unexpected that you discovered so far?
For instance, we're doing one pilot at the Bole Lamy Industry Park, where they have more than 20,000 workforce. So in that park, it's people that are doing manual labor. They're coming directly from the factory, and their hands are usually not as clean as someone who's working in an office. So every 2 or 3 person that has touched the fingerprint scanner, we need to wipe it, otherwise the quality drops. So that's something we've seen. We've also seen that a good percentage of people working in the fields have their fingerprint is not readable or not of sufficient quality for deduplication. So that's also confirming why we have chosen the usage of iris in addition to a fingerprint.
Okay, thank you. In terms of the diversity of pilot participants, how are you ensuring that, for instance, considering different demographics, socioeconomic factors such as gender, ethnicity, religion, we mentioned earlier, differently abled individuals, age group, income group, education levels, whether people are in the rural or urban areas or, have come from different occupations as well. And along with that, if you can answer how diverse was the team that was involved in the customization of the ID system, and as well as the team that is deploying the rollout.
The customization is still in progress. We've not had our final version yet. We're continually improving it. Not just us, MOSIP is also releasing newer and newer versions with better improvements. So there is different teams working on the customization as well as the rollout. We try to make sure, based on the specific locale, the language and the cultural understanding of the rollout, the enrollment officer, for instance, is matching.
Sorry, I didn't catch that last part.
So no, we make sure that the person doing the registration, our registration officer, understands the local context, the local language and culture. Okay,
that's definitely important. So I just want to bring your attention to, there was a case study done in 2019 by the Engine Room on digital identity in Ethiopian refugee camps, where UNHCR was issuing digital IDs. This revealed that when comprehensive biometric registration began, some of the refugees heard that, if their irises were scanned or their fingerprints were taken, they would subsequently be unable to leave the country. So how do you ensure in the process that citizens and residents have the right information, that they're not misinformed about the national ID program, and that any concerns that they have are being addressed in advance?
So we have made, number one, transparency, advocacy, and communication one big priority in our work. We make sure that starting from the beginning, starting from the legal framework, people are aware, people can give feedback, whether they are individuals, civil society, professional association, public, private entity, everyone is giving feedback. The draft law we've published on our website still up for input. It's not a final version. So we make sure there is good understanding and good communication, especially this is a project for the people, not for the government. It's for the individual. So we are operating and we are doing our operation with communication and advocacy in mind.
Okay, so now I'll give the audience an opportunity to ask this question directly. I don't see your name, but it says 85. You're welcome to ask a question. Okay, or I can read out the question, I guess. So this is the question from, it says number 85. I don't have your name. Like I said, it says to add an additional question, is the service ready to accommodate integration with business entities? If yes, what is the generic criteria?
If you can repeat a bit.
Okay, one second. Okay, is this service ready to accommodate integration? I'm guessing it's the ID system. Is it ready to accommodate integration with business entities? And if yes, what is the criteria? What is the criteria for businesses to get integrated to the ID system?
APIs that we published, the eKYC API, right now it's public because it's in a sandbox. So if you want to make your system digital ID compatible, you can start work now, whether you're a private entity, whether you have money or not. But at a later stage, there would be first, there would be an authorization process based on the detailed regulation who can authenticate, because if you are a bad actor, if you're not operating in good faith, you will not have authentication access. Mm-hmm. Second one is there would be a small amount of charge for every authentication. So there needs to be a commercial agreement between the authentication, the relying party, and the IDP. So the RP and the IDP have to have a commercial agreement. So that would be a second factor.
Okay. Thank you, Yodahe. I want to ask you one last question. And this is on what are the next steps for the program, and in what ways can interested digital financial services practitioners get involved? And once you answer that, if you can give us your final remarks.
So the question about digital finance practitioners was?
So how, what are the next steps of the program, and how can interested digital financial service practitioners, such as myself and, the alumni that we have here as well, how can they get involved in the program? And then if you can give us your final remarks before we wrap up.
So KYC is very important for any service provider, but more so for financial service providers, MFIs, banks, insurance, fintechs. They need KYC probably more than any other sector. So for trust is important in the payment ecosystem, because financial transaction needs to occur in a very trusted system environment. The reason why many digital services that are held back by the banks or by MFIs, microloans are held back. We're not as advanced as many of our neighbors even. So that one reason behind it, even though there is multiple reasons, one important reason is this lack of trust between the service provider and the individual. So if you have a payment platform, if you are a payment aggregator, if you are a fintech or some kind of lease company, or if you have an MFI, KYC is very important to you, and we're here to provide that service. Our focus is purely provision of identification. Our business is very narrow. We just offer this service of, are you who you say you are? That's all the guarantee we give. We don't give the guarantee whether that person is creditworthy. We don't give the guarantee of that person's level of income. So all that sector level information has to be managed by the sector. But we are here to provide you KYC, and that can be my finishing remark as well.
Okay, thank you so much, Yodahe, for your time, and participants as well for your questions. I've personally learned a lot, and I hope everyone has too. And I'm sure we're all looking forward to the successful deployment and rollout of the program. And I want to invite Ato Yosef to give final remarks so we can wrap up. I had more questions, but I understand you have another engagement, so I'll hand over to Ato Yosef to close. Thank you. Ato Yosef, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Mabit. Maybe most of you knows me, but for those who do not knows me, my name is Yosef. I've been in the industry, in the financial industry for the last 20 years in different banks and payment processing company. I'm speaking here now representing the Association of Ethiopian Digital Finance Practitioners, were licensed in November 2021. And these associations, with the objective of building the capacity of digital finance practitioner, carry out training, research workshops, and alumni conferences, and also advocate about DFS to various stakeholders. This alumni is prepared by the Association of Digital Finance Practitioner and Association of Ethiopia Microfinance. Together, we did such a platform. I really appreciate Ato Yodahe because we gave him, in a short notice, and he gave us very informative, well-described, and very insightful presentations he did in his project. This project is currently running in the country, which requires, very much dedication in time, effort, and energy. He gave us, more than 1 hour in this platform. Definitely, he may have also prepared earlier for this presentation. So we really appreciate, his presentation, to give us such kinds of very informative presentation. I also thank you, Mabit, for well moderations and well managed platform. So I really thank you, both of you, in this regard. I also want to thank all the participants, who have raised your questions, who are learning, listening this platform. There was 50 plus participants in this platform. So the Association of Ethiopia Digital Finance Practitioner is already established in November, and we have around 30 plus members. We all of you invited, to be the member of these associations. As I said earlier, the objective is, clearly we do on the objective for inclusion, for financial inclusions, as I said earlier. So all of you here are, in one way or another way, you are the part and parcel of the financial ecosystem. So you all are kindly invited to attend or to be the member of the associations. You may contact me or Ato Toshoma, the Association of Ethiopia Microfinance Ethiopia director. So you can reach us to be the member of these associations. We also plan to have such kinds of local webinars for in the year, and also we'll do international 2 webinars. For that also, those who have research work, conference experience to share, you're also welcome, invited to do such kinds of presentation, whether it is as a presenter or as a moderator. We all of you invited for that. So I thank you very much. We had a very good discussion, learning sessions. I think with no any other things, we conclude the alumni meeting. Thank you very much.